welcome to Counterpunch Radio and Counterpunch Plus if you're watching on the subscription site. My name is Eric Draitser. Thanks so much for tuning in, coming back to the show. Hope you've had a chance to get that subscription to Counterpunch Plus. That is the way to support Counterpunch, to keep the lights on, to keep this media project going. If you believe in independent media, particularly as big tech and all of the other sectors of capital seem to try to tighten their grip on the flow of information, well, Counterpunch has been around for more than 25 years, and we plan to be around for a lot more years with your support and with your help. Please go to the website, get a subscription to Counterpunch Plus. You can read everything that used to be in the print magazine, plus a lot of new content. Jeff Sinclair is churning out content like crazy. All of the archive stuff from 2.5 decades of print magazines, including Alexander Coburn's classic columns, all of the other great contributors over the years. You can have access to all of it, plus these videos that I'm doing with these great guests. Get your subscription. What are you waiting for? Go do it now. Okay. I am going to end the sales pitch there, and I'm going to turn to my wonderful guest today. Helen Yaffe is with me. She is a lecturer in economic and social history at the University of Glasgow, specializing in Cuban and Latin American development. And most importantly, for our purposes today, she is the author of the excellent recent book, We Are Cuba, How a Revolutionary People Have Survived in a Post-Soviet World. I would recommend that book as well as a previous book, Che Guevara, The Economics of Revolution. Helen Yaffe, welcome to Counterpunch.
Thank you. Thanks for the invite.
Thank you so much for coming on and for all of your great work. And I want to just jump right into it because the first thing that strikes me when I look at your book, and this is, of course, a little bit about me, but the first thing that strikes me is the title, We Are Cuba. So movie nerd like me, immediately that evokes a tremendous amount of thought. So tell me very quickly, if you could, about the title, how it was chosen, why it was chosen.
Well, whether you like or don't like the title, I can't take entirely the credit. I think I was struggling with my editor to find a title that was not too academic, but also encapsulated the topic of the book. So that's what we arrived at. I think the point is that the book tries to present what we can call an imminent critique of Cuba. So judging Cuba by its own standards, trying to assess what they have achieved in development terms, according to what the objectives were and the challenges that they face. So in that sense, and it's based on extensive interviews with Cubans in each of the sectors that I write about. I've tried to find, the people most involved, the people playing leading roles, influencing the direction and decisions and so on. So that was also to capture the sense that this was their voices being represented in the book.
Absolutely. And of course, I Am Cuba being the famous Soviet Cuban film of the early 1960s, which for a lot of us was maybe the first window we had into something about Cuba. It certainly was for me when I was about 18 years old. So, all right, I want to talk a little bit about this book and how it took shape. What was the impetus for writing it? When did this begin? And what were the conditions that sort of drove you to making this into this book project?
So, well, because I've been engaging with Cuba for a long time, since 1995, when I went to live in Cuba as a teenager. I was 18 and I went with my big sister, no parents and no family beyond that. So we just went to live in Cuba. It was 1995. It was more or less the worst period of what's known as the special period of economic crisis following the collapse of the Soviet bloc, because, of course, nearly 90% of Cuba's trade and investment disappeared practically overnight with the collapse of the Soviet bloc. So, in 1989, Cuba was importing 13 million tons of oil from the Soviets. And by 1991, that was 1 million. The next year, it was nothing. So, how do you deal with that kind of crisis? Amazing collective creative solutions. The government policies were always directed with welfare at the center rather than, opening up to markets and focusing on GDPs and so on. So we lived in Cuba around that period. The tide had just turned. The economy was starting to recover. they were starting to introduce international tourism and so on. And so I've continued my engagement with Cuba. I helped to set up a youth solidarity group, or Rock Around the Blockade, it's called, set up in Britain. We were making links between the way that the British government in 1995 was treating young people. Now, I don't expect you to remember this, but we had just had this law called the Criminal Justice Act, which was criminalizing when young people were getting together to listen to music. You know, it was criminalizing music specifically of over 180 beats per minute and so on. And at the same time, when people who saw the situation Cuba was going through and reached out to the Youth Communist League in Cuba, or the Union of Young Communists in Cuba, and said, what can we do to help? The Union of Young Communists in Cuba said, our young people need music. So it was just an incredible contradiction. On the one hand, in capitalist Britain, you know, they saw youth culture as a threat. And on the other hand, in Cuba, they were trying to, you know, facilitate young people, saying, we're struggling, we're going through austerity, economic crisis, but young people have to have the capacity to enjoy themselves, you know, and we don't want them to associate or we don't want to only associate socialism with austerity. So we started raising money to buy sound systems and disco equipment at their request, and take them out on brigades to Cuba. So my engagement with Cuba continued. And then as I started to work on my PhD, which you mentioned, because it was published subsequently as Che Guevara, The Economics of Revolution. And I was doing all my archive research out in Cuba. I managed to interview many times, became great friends with Orlando Borrego, who was Che Guevara's deputy outside of the military field. So he was his number two in the Department of Industrialization, then the Ministry of Industries, before leaving to become Cuba's first minister of sugar in a country with a history dominated by sugar. So I was interviewing Borrego, and many of the people I interviewed, well over 50 of the people who'd worked closest to Che Guevara in this field of, transforming the economy. And anyway, so the point is, my engagement had continued with Cuba, and I was aware of these incredible developments that were taking place, essentially as one US medical scientist put it to me from the Cancer Institute, Boswell Park. He said it was under the radar, these incredible developments. Now, under the radar, partly because, you know, when I was reading about Cuba in universities, the English language texts are so dominated by a particular interpretation that works within a certain paradigm. And it's, very dogmatic. Cuba is treated as a dogma. And, you know, there's a set series of interpretations. There is no democracy in Cuba. The Castros dominate all decision making. Cuba wouldn't survive without the Soviet Union. So, 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, well, then you start to wonder, well, how did they survive? So putting those two things together, the fact that the Cuban Revolution had survived for longer without the Soviet support than it had with Soviet support, and then that, undermining that argument. And secondly, these incredible developments in the fields of biotechnology. I mean, Cuba has the world's only lung cancer immunotherapy. They were the first with a meningitis B vaccine back in the 1980s, and meningitis B has continued to kill people all around the world, not just in poor countries throughout Africa, but also in Britain and the United States. Cuba was the first country in the world to complete a transition to energy-saving bulbs. They did that within 6 months. They have popped up in numerous reports as world leaders in sustainable development. Scientific reports that are evaluating on the basis of scientific research. So there's all these incredible aspects of Cuban development that had taken place under the radar and since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I really wanted to investigate those further and bring those to a broader audience, because, occasionally the Cubans would pop up in West Africa assisting with the Ebola pandemic, and, mainstream media wouldn't know what to make of it. How are the Cubans there? The same with the earthquake in Haiti. and so on. So, behind all of these things, there is a story of a strategy at the very early years of the revolution to invest in health and education, but also science and technology, and to have a very different set of priorities for their development model, and that's what I was interested in.
Absolutely. And I want to return to a lot of those topics towards the end of our discussion, thinking about how some of those sectors did develop specifically. But let's take a step back, if we could, and talk a little bit about Cuba before the revolution. Of course, we're talking now, 70 plus years in the past. But what was pre revolutionary Cuba like? What specifically the material conditions? Who had the wealth? Who owned the land? Was there industry? Where were the masses of people? Tell us a little bit about Cuba so we can get a picture of what the revolution was responding to.
Yeah, so even in this area, there's a great deal of debate and difference in interpretation, which is actually very much politically motivated. So, on the one hand, you have those who look at Cuba and say, oh, well, its GDP per capita was third or fifth in Latin America. Therefore, it was a wealthy, capitalist country. It was about to take off. That's the interpretation of some economic historians. And others say, well, no, because the economy was characterized by a set of crises, structural crises and imbalances. And that is certainly, I think, the situation in Cuba. So you have a model, a plantation, slave labor based model of sugar production, which really takes off after the Haitian Revolution, when a lot of the French planters move to Cuba and take slaves with them, and then that sees an influx of more investment in the sugar plantation, an incredible number of slaves taken to Cuba, and even once, with independence in Latin America, you have the abolition of slavery. It takes quite a couple of decades in some of those countries, but in Cuba it's sustained. So it's one of the hubs of the second slavery. It carries on, of course, in the southern states of the United States and in Brazil. And then you have this interesting dichotomy, which I'm researching as someone who's at the University of Glasgow. It's an avenue I'm really interested in. So you have the sort of mechanization of the sugar plantations with machinery, including from Glasgow. So we have, archives full of the account books of Glasgow manufacturers who are sending to Cuba, a machinery that's associated with the Industrial Revolution, with moving from slave type feudal social relations to capitalist social relations. But in Cuba, it's being used to intensify the exploitation of slave-based production. So you have incredible contradictions built into this model. Are some of the characteristics which we see today in Cuba, which seem inexplicable, that the revolution hasn't overcome. I'm talking, for example, about the fact that Cuba is so dependent on food imports. But I've recently started to read up on more on that, and you can see that this is one of the legacies of the imposition of the sugar industry, and not just in the interests of Cuban sugar elite or the US owners of sugar plantations in Cuba, but also in the interests of the lobby of agro-business in the United States that did not want Cuba to have the capacity to produce its basic staples for consumption, for food consumption, because they were benefiting from selling those to Cuba. And everything about the relationship, the trade relationship between Cuba and the United States was highly regulated. So Cuba was subject, like many countries in the US sort of peripheral sphere of influence, to a sugar quota, which determined how much sugar it could produce and export every year to the United States. But also, the trade between them was determined by tariff reductions and so on. And the US interest came out of those relationships in a more beneficial position. So when the Cuban Revolution takes over, you have a lot of structural imbalances. You have, for example, in Cuba, 3 oil refineries, which are using really high-tech, technology. And at the same time, in a sense, they're surrounded by seas of underdevelopment So the sugar industry dominates employment, but it also dominates the it dominates every form of society. So most of other production is somehow linked to the sugar industry. And sugar industry workers are doing this incredibly tough work with machetes in the searing heat of the Caribbean, under the Caribbean sun. And they're working about 3 to 4 months for the harvest every year. It's been extended since then, but at that time, that's what it was. And after that, the period where they're laid off and they have no social security, that is the period known as a tiempo muerto, the dead period, or the dead season. And they're just basically, people are struggling to survive and finding alternative employment. At the same time, you can look at the statistics. This is why, I always say we have to be very careful of statistics. You can look at the statistics of the number of luxury cars per person in Cuba, and all the rest of it. And clearly in Havana there was a great deal of superficial prosperity. Havana was used as a sort of a holiday resort for US business people, US businessmen, probably predominantly. It was full of casinos and brothels, and those kind of aspects that characterize, the sort of Cuba in the 1950s. And they were all very real, and they had a very high human cost, which is reflected in the statistics of the number of children in the countryside who were walking around with parasites in their belly, who had no shoes, who had no toilets in their homes, who had no electricity. I mean, an incredible the number of people in Cuba who had electricity in the countryside was something like 2% of the population. So, this creates phenomenal challenges for the new revolutionary government when they seize state power. It's not just a question of, what do you do with the army and Batista and his cronies, although they fled. It's not just a question. There's no immediate and easy ways of dealing with this. So you've promised massive investments in road building, hospital building, schools, clinics, and so on. But where's the money? The money has literally been packed into suitcases and taken out of the country. So how are you going to carry out those investments? How do you extend the electricity system to supply it to the people in rural areas? So these are all just incredible challenges that are the product of Cuba's status as a colonized nation, then subject to imperialism and a very exploitative relationship, but also with a domestic elite that was whose position was very much determined by their relationship with US capital and with US interests.
Indeed. And to your point about the dependence on food importation, the United States did something very similar in Haiti with rice and rice production, Haiti being dependent upon rice imports from the US when Haiti was a rice exporter for decades and decades. And that policy, of course, extends to Venezuela. It's extended to other countries in Latin America that have also been made dependent upon food imports as a sort of way of tying them to the empire. Now, my question for you then would be, in the well, actually, let me just quickly back up. How did the attitude towards the United States change in Cuba? And what I mean specifically is, I know that in the late 19th and early 20th century, the United States was seen in a much more positive light because of the Spanish crown, and the Spanish being the seat of reaction. And Cubans, many Cubans, middle class bourgeois Cubans, saw the U.S. as a hope for democracy. And 50 years later, of course, the U.S. dominates Cuba as an imperial neighbor. So how did that change?
Well, I mean, how did it change? Has it changed? I think there's always been different attitudes among Cubans towards the United States, and that has been characterized through history. So, for example, you have the annexationists who wanted, who saw that it would be beneficial to themselves and to Cuba if Cuba was annexed formally to the United States. Then you had another group called this sort of autonomists who wanted a relationship with the United States, much like what turned out to be the pseudo republic, but not formally annexed, maybe politically sovereign, but essentially, in the orbit, very much in the orbit of the United States. And then you had the independentistas, those who wanted complete independence for Cuba, which means economic and political sovereignty. And that was the strand represented very much by Jose Marti, who is known as the national independence hero of Cuba, who helped to spark the final war of independence in Cuba, 1895, and then subsequently died very early on in that, going into battle. And Jose Marti, Jose Marti is an interesting character because he's claimed by some of the Miami Cubans who articulate a kind of Cuban nationalism but reject the Cuban Revolution and socialism. He's also claimed that by the Cuban revolutionary leadership, as they are the legacy of Jose Marti. And so in part, it could depend on which part of his work you take. And there's a very important letter that Marti wrote just before, the night before, I believe, that he goes into battle. And it's an uncompleted letter because he died in battle the next day. But in this letter, he articulates very, very clearly that while the Cuban forces were fighting against the Spanish, they must also beware the imperialist ambitions of the United States. And so that kind of warning that comes with Marti, and this is obviously before the US, the explosion of the Maine, and the US has intervened and so on. That sort of forevision of Marti has been integrated into the revolutionary struggle for some elements in the throughout up to the 1950s. I mean, don't forget there was a revolution in Cuba in 1933 as well, which led to what's known as the 100-day government. So that vision, some revolutionaries in Cuba and independence fighters have integrated that, and that gives the deep historical roots of Cuban anti-imperialism. So so I think in a sense we can say that the revolution, the revolutionary state that emerges after 1959 takes that strand from Marti. It is inherently anti-imperialist. It sees that for Cuba to be a sovereign nation, and this is the other core aspect, the core demand at the heart of the Cuban Revolution, to prioritize social justice, then it needs to take a position against US imperialism to defend its sovereignty, essentially. So that's really important. Also, US domination of Cuba is associated with the opposite of social justice, with the exploitation and discrimination, the embedded institutional racism, and so on, that period of Cuban history demonstrated. So what do we see today? We can still see that the predominant view within Cuba is very much this anti-imperialist attitude towards the United States, which I think it's really important to emphasize does not translate into anti-Americanism. Cubans regard themselves as Americans in the sense that, the whole continent is the Americas. And Jose Marti talked about Nuestra America, our America, although he counterposed that to North America, to the ambitions of imperialist North America. But the point is that, most Cubans have relatives in the United States, and the animosity is not on the level of hating Americans. It is a defensive position against US establishments, which have, spent millions and strategized for 62 years about how to get rid of the Cuban government. On the other hand, what you still see in Miami is the continuation of those other interpretations, right? Those who want Cuba to be essentially, maybe not now formally part of the United States of America, but very much embedded into the US sphere of interest and under US domination again. And that is being increasingly clearly articulated by Cubans in, the pro-Trump Cubans in Miami.
Okay, let's take a quick break. If you're listening to the free audio, enjoy the music. If you're on Counterpunch Plus, we'll be back in just a few seconds. And we are back chatting with Helen Yaffe. Get yourself a copy of the book, We Are Cuba: How a Revolutionary People Have Survived in a Post Soviet World. It is fascinating. This is one of the things that we on the left have been watching for a long time and take great pride in, is understanding how Cuba and the resolve that Cuba has shown in the face of imperialism, as we were just discussing before the break. Helen, let me talk a little bit about the blockade, because it figures so centrally in everything that has happened for decades and decades with regard to Cuba. Can you tell us the story of this blockade, how the blockade happened, and then maybe a little bit about how it's evolved, and most importantly, some of the concrete and material ways in which it has hampered Cuban development, and or maybe even inspired other ways of development, let's say.
Yeah, because it's done both those things. So the US blockade sanctions has to be understood as one tool in the toolkit of the United States to achieve regime change in Cuba. So it becomes very clear, the documentation has been exposed, that already by the end of 1959, the US establishment, whether it's the CIA, the State Department, has decided that they can't tolerate the new revolutionary government in Cuba, and they have to get rid of it. So 1959. So then they go about looking at ways to dismantle the new government, to stop it settling and institutionalizing and so on. What you have is, by 1960, a conclusion, and this is articulated in the famous memorandum by Lester Mallory, 6th of April 1960. He says, look, the Castro is too popular. He has the support of the vast majority of Cubans. It's clear that communist influence in the new Cuban government is increasing. Sending in external forces is going to be rejected, although they did that and it was defeated, as we know. It was the Bay of Pigs invasion. So what we need to do is use all of the means at our disposal to enact a deterioration of the economic situation. In other words, we need to create economic hardship. So the final conclusion, the words he uses, to create hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. So this has been the, let's call it, two-track tactic of the United States towards Cuba, to use mechanisms to achieve economic asphyxiation. And that is the role of sanctions and the US blockade. And at the same time, to try and exploit the consequences of that, so the hardship that Cubans are suffering, in order to foster and promote an internal opposition that would not have existed otherwise. So that's been the intention of the US blockade. I mean, what happened is, in the early days, you had that tit for tat situation where it started. I mean, you can never work out where it quite started, but very significantly, the US government told the oil refineries not to refine Soviet oil that was on the way, that the Cubans were importing, and the Cubans responded by nationalizing the oil industry. And so this sort of tit for tat went on and on. Subsequently, I mean, what's really important about Mallory's memorandum is it exposes a few myths about the US blockade, the US sanctions. First, that they are a punishment for the nationalizations, because the document by Mallory happens before the mass nationalizations of US businesses and interests. And secondly, it shows that the human rights of Cubans is not on the radar. There's no mention in that. To propose a policy of creating hunger and desperation, it clearly exposes the myth that you're concerned about human rights. So that this is, the US, people talk about the blockade, but actually it's a set of about 6 very, very complex, overlapping, sometimes contradictory pieces of legislation. I've just written a book chapter about it. There's a new book called Sanctions as War, and I've written a chapter on the US blockade. So I've been looking into, the process of augmenting the blockade. So initially it's eliminating or targeting trade between the United States and Cuba, but gradually it becomes more and more extraterritorial. So by 1992, the Torricelli Act it's very significant that it's extraterritorial. Why? The Soviet bloc has collapsed. As we said at the beginning, Cuba's lost its main trading partner. Only 10% of Cuba's international trade is carried out outside of that socialist bloc and with the USSR and the other countries of Eastern Europe. So at this point, Cuba faces this incredible challenge. On the one hand, they declare we're going to stay as a socialist country, but on the other hand, they have to integrate into an international market, a global economy, which is now dominated by capitalism in the era of neoliberalism. So it's an incredibly complex process. The Cuban economy is almost entirely restructured to go from being an exporter of goods, sugar, to being an exporter of services, that is tourism and then medical professional services. So at this point, when Cuba has to integrate with the rest of the world, the United States sanctions take on the nature of becoming extraterritorial. And what we mean by that is that this is US domestic law, but it starts to impose itself on Cuba's trade, on other domestic laws and transactions. So it tries to interrupt Cuba's capacity to trade with the rest of the world. How does it do that? It says, for example, that any piece of equipment or machinery, whatever it is, produced anywhere in the world, if it has more than 10% of its components made by a US company, then it cannot be sold to Cuba. It also says that any ship that docks in Cuba for the purposes of carrying out trade cannot dock in the United States for 6 months after. It uses the leverage that the United States has over the US dollar. The US dollar dominates international trade. So, according to the Wall Street Journal, in 2019, 88% of all international transactions were carried out in the dollar. The US has leverage over and control over what can be done with the US dollar. So it has simply said, particularly in the recent period and under the Trump sanctions, which I hope we'll talk about with more focus, it has said that banks cannot transact with Cuba when they're using the US dollar. So, I mean, it is incredible asphyxiation of Cuba. We've already talked about Cuba needing to import a large proportion of its food. But even beyond that, I mean, Cuba is a small island nation. Small island nations are dependent on exchange and trade with other countries, and so it has the sanctions have taken on this character of blocking Cuba's capacity to trade with individuals and entities who want to trade with Cuba, who will benefit from trade with Cuba. And this affects, by the way, Cuba's exports in medical science, so biotechnology, all sorts of things that Cuba has that would be beneficial for populations around the world that are blocked by these sanctions that have been in place for 60 years.
Recent years, there was a lot of talk about the U.S. normalizing with Cuba, steps by the Obama administration towards so-called normalization. Suppose that's debatable whether that's actually what was happening, but that's beside the point. Where do we stand now in this bizarre dystopian post-Trump period that we now live through? What did Trump do, or rather, what did Obama introduce? What did Trump do as a reaction to that, and where do we stand now?
Yeah, so I think it's worth remembering and not being sort of nostalgic for, Obama who finally saw sense kind of interpretation. Obama did nothing for 6 years. So Obama actually continued the rhetoric, we'll punish Cuba as long as it abuses human rights. Cuba's not a democracy and all the rest of it. He took a few small measures. He allowed the amount of remittances to increase or whatever. But he didn't move on Cuba until his final, 2 to 3 years. And essentially, in the first place, that was too little too soon. And secondly, none of the measures that he took had any sort of legal endurance. So they were executive decrees that he signed. He allowed a set of companies to engage with Cuba. He allowed some cruise ships. He allowed some airlines to do chartered flights. He allowed a few hotel companies. But though, as Trump came out and said when he went to Miami and he was looking for the Miami vote, he said everything that Obama did was with presidential, you know, uh, executive, whatever, but privilege, and I can remove it and I will. And he did that. That's what Trump did. I mean, it's also interesting. The first 6 months of Trump's presidency, he didn't move on Cuba. But then, you know, apparently Marco Rubio, these very powerful Cuban American politicians. I mean, they say Cuban American. This is a second generation Cuban American who's apparently never even visited Cuba, but has built a career on the basis of being anti-Cuban and trying to bring down the Cuban regime, as he calls it. So, you know, complaints by them that they hadn't done enough. And then these people get themselves in key roles. So apparently he was, you know, important in the Senate investigation of Russian interference in Trump's election campaign. So what Trump did was he took the same position as most US presidents, and he delegated his Cuba policy to this sort of sector of very right-wing Cuban American politicians, and they went all out for Cuba. I mean, they obviously associated Cuba very much with Venezuela and Bolivia, and they had taken, and Ecuador, their measures had been taken in those countries to undermine or overthrow the left-wing governments. They saw Venezuela, Maduro and the PSUV's survival in Venezuela, despite the millions being thrown at creating an internal opposition, despite, you know, the announcement that Guaido was a new president and so on. The fact that they survived in Venezuela, they blamed that on Cuba. So the objective was really to knock out, as they saw it, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. So how did they do that? I mean, how do you take a set of sanctions, you know, 6 fundamental laws, very, very complex, comprehensive laws that have been ongoing for 6 years, and how do you make that more intense, you know? I remember an interview with the Cuban guy, Cosio, who leads the US department in Cuba, and the interviewer said, Trump says, you know, if Cuba doesn't stop supporting Venezuela, then they're going to introduce more sanctions. And Cosio said, well, they've had sanctions against us for 60 years. What more can they do? You know, and I sort of was in the same position, but they had incredible punitive persecution of all of Cuba's workarounds. So how has Cuba managed to carry out international trade despite those things that I was talking about? Is use something called U-turn transactions in the international financial system. And those were identified and eliminated. Banks are now absolutely terrified to do any transaction with Cuba. It's almost impossible to send money to Cuba, let alone trade with Cuba or invest in Cuba. And that has been the intention. You know, Cuba is they've come up with creative solutions. They've developed alliances with people who will help them to circumvent the US blockade for 60 years. But the Trump administration passed 242 new action, sanctions, and coercive measures, including, by the way, phoning up the presidents of countries in Latin America that have requested Cuban medical assistance and threatening them and saying, you know, we won't allow you to take on these Cubans because it's doing too much. It's first of all, it's where it's not the Henry Reeve brigades, which are usually emergency medical assistance that's unpaid, but where it's the contracts, this has become the greatest source of revenue for Cuba. But they're saving lives all over the world, and they're improving lives too. So 243 coercive measures, over 50 of them since the pandemic began. So when the United Nations and other international bodies were calling on countries like the United States that impose unilateral sanctions, in fact, all sanctions, they said, please stop all sanctions in the context of the pandemic that affect a country's ability to respond to the pandemic and to provide the medical care and so on that is necessary. And the Trump administration increased sanctions at that point. And the impact of it was immediate, and it was, really exposes the utter hypocrisy of the United States establishment talking about its concern for human rights and welfare in Cuba. The first big piece of news was that Cuba could not import medical ventilators for its ICU units. Why? It had two ventilators. They came from it had bought ventilators from two Swiss companies, but they had been bought out by a US company. So they would no longer be able to sell to Cuba. Cuba said, well, right, can we have spare parts for the ventilators we had? No, you can't have spare parts. So they couldn't even sell spare parts for medical ventilators in the context of a pandemic where which was killing people through respiratory disease. Secondly, now, they can't get hold of syringes for similar reasons. So the syringe manufacture globally is dominated by something like 6 companies that all have some link to the United States or US markets, or subsidiaries of companies that do. So you have this terrible, agonizing dichotomy where Cuba is the only country in Latin America and the Caribbean to have produced its own vaccines for COVID-19, vaccines with a 90+% efficacy. 3 different vaccines they have now. They're about to start vaccinating children in Cuba. And at the same time, they have to appeal to the international solidarity movement for assistance in purchasing syringes and other, pieces of medical equipment that are mass produced.
In the time that we have remaining, I'm going to choke back my outrage at everything that you just said and ask a different question. Can you talk a little bit about this word reforms? We hear a lot about how, well, Cuba was doing X and then they introduced some degree of reforms. And, you hear various iterations of that phrase, but it's often quite ambiguous what exactly that means. So can you talk a little bit about reforms, economic reforms, and what reforms, quote unquote, have been introduced over recent years and what effects they've had?
Yeah, so I mean, the word reform is associated in in the left with reformism and reformist, which indicates reforming back towards capitalism essentially. And I think at the start of the process initiated by Raul Castro, particularly with the announcement of changes in the employment structure, there even the Cubans were referring to those as updating the system or adjusting the system, and that's what they were. Whereas there is a tendency from outside to say, well, these are reforms. In other words, this is the embrace of capitalism. What I would caution is that none of these decisions, these policy decisions, can be understood, the motives, the intentions, the challenges they're supposed to overcome, without contextualizing those questions. So, for example, I just mentioned the employment changes to the employment structure. So at the point where this law was introduced, a tiny proportion of Cubans were working outside the state sector. And there are cooperatives, agricultural cooperatives, that don't count as the state sector. And there was a very small level, like 2.4% of Cubans were self-employed. But what had happened is during the very difficult years of the special period, the Cuban state had taken the decision to keep people in employment. And it had done that to ensure that everyone had a minimum salary. And yes, the salary is very low, although you can't measure the salary against what people can access, because so much of what Cubans get is fully or almost fully subsidized by the state. So it's not like, in our countries to say, what's your salary? And with that salary, you have to purchase, your basically everything that you need. In Cuba, it's not like that. But also, employment has a political and social role in Cuba. It's how many people are integrated into political decision making. It's social networks and so on. So they took the decision to keep Cubans in employment, despite the fact that some of them weren't producing because during the special period, raw materials were not entering, machinery had broken down, and they couldn't get spare parts. So you had a cycle of low productivity and low salaries. Now, from the 2000s, and with the relationship with Venezuela, Chavez, the oil for doctors programs that many of your listeners will know about, the economy started to improve, and Cuba actually had some quite impressive growth rates in around the sort of mid 2000s and going on. So it meant that they were in a better economic situation to start to tackle this problem of low productivity. Hence, you get, after a long consultation and national consultation with the population about the main problems and complaints that they have, something unprecedented, I think, that happens in Cuba with regular frequency, you get the decision to open up many more new forms of employment and to encourage people to leave the state sector where they are unproductive and yet paid for by the state to go and do productive work in other non-strategic areas. So from outside, it's seen from some elements of the left and from the right and from the medias an embrace of capitalism, because it's shifting people from the state sector to the non-state sector. But actually, it is trying to deal with this historic problem that, it is a problem of socialist political economy, and that is the productivity of labor. So I tried to go through all these different reforms that took place in the, I call them Raul Castro's reforms, in the Raul era. It's basically 10 years. And I tried to explain the problems that each of these measures were intended to resolve, the challenges that they faced in the process of implementation, and what was achieved. So, I mean, it's too much to sort of go through now, but they all had a purpose for being introduced. And the purpose was not an ideological or political embrace of markets. In fact, they were all very restrained within a certain limit. And, in fact, what I'm trying to show is that throughout the revolution since 1959 or maybe 61, the Cuban Revolution has been incredibly flexible in the kind of policies that have been introduced to deal with problems that sometimes internally imposed, sometimes externally imposed. But they have had the capacity to have more opening to the market and then more closure and more return to the state, and the increase in the state's monopoly over trade and investment and decision making and so on. And it's like a pendulum. It swung between those limits, but it's stuck within those limits that determine that Cuba has socialist social relations. What's happening now is that the situation in Cuba is so difficult in terms of getting capital into Cuba, and people, say, oh, capital, that's capitalism. Capital means they need the resources to invest, to update their worn out infrastructure, and to actually make the improvements to the standard of living which Cuban people require and need, and really, quite frankly, deserve. So how do they get that capital? Well, because of this constant aggression from the United States, the two channels for getting money into the country that they've determined are the safest is foreign direct investment, where they can negotiate under the radar, behind closed doors, with specific entities and businesses, and they negotiate very, very strict terms that protect the environment, protect workers' conditions, and so on. And the other is remittances. Now, in order to encourage remittances, they have promoted self-employment, because that is a form of getting money in, people sending money to their families, who's setting up a small restaurant and whatever it is. They have had to go further and further with this process of opening, because they have faced such incredible restrictions. I mean, the potential that this process of development, they have a development plan to 2030, its potential has been massively hamstrung by sanctions. They've opened Mariel Special Development Zone. They had hundreds of companies lining up, putting in requests to do business, and it was, high tech businesses, high skilled businesses. It was going to bring a lot of technology transfer to Cuba. It was going to really raise Cuba's technological capacity, and so on. Cuba has skilled workers that, it has an incredibly educated workforce. But this has also, to an extent, been scuppered by the sanctions imposed under Trump, and continued and even augmented now by the Biden administration.
We just have a couple of minutes left, and in that time, I want to just quickly ask you, before we in the United States became enamored of the most recent shiny object on television, people were talking about protests in Cuba several weeks ago. And I want to just ask you a little bit about the protests. First of all, I say protests because I don't know if I want to use the word protest movement, because that would imply something else. But tell us a little bit about the recent upsurge of public protests in Cuba. I guess embedded in that is a couple of questions. Number one, how related is it to the ongoing blockade? How related is it to COVID and the impacts of COVID on the economy, and maybe on even on the social fabric? And then maybe you could also tell us a little bit about the COVID situation.
Yeah, okay. I'm sorry. I try and answer that as concisely as possible, but these are all really big issues, and I'm trying to avoid sort of soundbite responses. Um, so, in relation to the protests, these protests happened in, probably, I've heard an analyst say, dozen cities. They involved hundreds of people in each place. They were the first violent protests in 27 years, which, if you just look at any of Cuba's neighbors and the United States, you'll see how incredible that is. Cuba was really characterized by social stability. The last protest, which took place in 1994 during the special period, was in one city. So these were qualitatively much more significant. However, they were. I had written a report on an update on the situation in Cuba in June, and I'd said, talking about this incredible hardships that the Cubans are living through. Cubans are getting up at dawn every morning to join queues outside stores where the goods might not enter until 10 or 11, right? So they're queuing for 8 hours to get these goods. Before going to do a full day's work, or caring, or whatever else it is. So the situation is quite unbearable, and yet the Cubans have borne it. And that's what I was saying in my report. They have shown incredible endurance and patience, but we shouldn't be surprised if there is a social explosion. What happened on the 11th of July is that finally, after millions invested, after 6 decades of regime change programs, there was some result from this dual track effort to have to use political economic asphyxiation to create an internal opposition. But we also need to be clear about what was really going on. There were different protesters there for different reasons. On the one hand, there was a lot of coordination from external forces as part of a campaign directed, through US aid and so on, funding for regime change programs. And the social media war has been a big component of that, with YouTubers and, and influencers, as they're called. They have been daily haranguing Cubans, get out on the street, protest, and also there's been cases of people using YouTube to offer Cubans money to throw Molotov cocktails, to carry out arson, to assassinate police. It's out there. The evidence is out there. They're offering Cubans phone credit to attack police officers in Cuba, or to attack other people. So this has been going on for a long, long time. And they've had several pushes. There was every now and then you have 4 people get together and shout down with the dictatorship, and it's filmed. The most important thing is it's material for social media that gets circulated. On that day, on the 11th of July, something happened. The spark happened because of the discontent. There were also people out there who went out, who have a record of criminal activities and so on, and the Cuban government has been, citing criminal records and so on. But there was also a lot of people out there who joined the protest because they are frustrated and angry about the situation. They're exhausted, understandably, about this hardship that has been externally imposed on the island. And yes, there are all sorts of internal problems with bureaucracy and slowness and not carrying out decisions that have been made in relation to the reforms and so on and so forth. But we have to be clear that the level of external intervention, we have to be clear about the level of external intervention in those protests. So some really interesting factors. The predominant slogans on those protests were abstract political demands. Abajo down with the dictatorship, or swearing at the president. We want freedom, country and life. But when people protest genuinely about their conditions, they tend to chant about the things that are affecting them. We want medicines, we want food, we're sick of queues. So that is a very interesting thing that I've seen a Chilean analyst go into this material. But also, you saw throughout these protests the repetitive presence of certain logos. Cuba decide, Cuba decides. That's the name of a US-funded organization based in Miami that is involved in promoting instability and regime change in Cuba. So why was this apparently spontaneous protest, but you had these prearranged symbols, placards appearing at them? So there was some very, and then there's all the issues that have been analysed. I don't know how much has reached the US English language media, but about the Twitter campaign that led up to the protest. So there was a new media company was set up in June and launched a hashtag SOS Cuba. And on the day it launched the hashtag SOS Cuba, it received the Florida state certificate saying that it could get funding. So this is a media company which apparently has been set up in order with funding as part of the regime change programs in order to use social media to try and help instigate internal protests in Cuba. Tweets like SOS Cuba that were going out from some Twitter handles, with retweets 5 times a second. So clearly the use of what do they call them, bots and troll farms and so on. So all of that automation of this message going out, geolocations on Twitter handles changed so they appeared to be in Cuba and so on. And then you had the incredible manipulation after the event, which I was more witness to. I was in Cuba on the 11th of July. I didn't see any protests. I was leaving the quarantine hotel because I'd arrived in Cuba 5 days earlier and had to quarantine. And I had gone to my home in Havana, where I stay, and I was watching the football, the England Euro finals, because England was playing. And the announcement got interrupted by President Diaz-Canel making an announcement. He informed the Cuban population that protests had taken place around the country. And they showed footage of him going to a place called San Antonio de los Baños, where the protests had turned violent. And he had gone, just like Fidel Castro had gone during that protest I mentioned in 1994, he'd gone straight to the scene. Miguel Diaz-Canel did the same in San Antonio. And they showed him talking to the population who were out in the streets. And he was recognizing that they are suffering at the moment, that there is a lot of hardship and times are hard. But he was warning, do not allow your legitimate views to be manipulated by an externally funded campaign. So then he'd gone on the television and he'd ended with this rousing speech saying the streets belong to the revolutionaries. And at that signal, thousands of Cubans had gone out in towns and cities throughout the country. They'd gone to key centers and squares, and they were basically in support of the government and in support of socialism, opposing the US blockade and US interference. But in the following days, there was incredible manipulation of what had happened. For a start, many news outlets were circulating these photos of the protesters in support of the government and socialism and claiming that they were anti-government protesters. There was even photos of from 2011 from the Malecon in Egypt, when tens of thousands of people had gone out to protest against the government, and it was circulated as if it was the Malecon in Havana, despite the fact that many people, if you zoomed in on the photo, had Egyptian flags, right? The same happened with images. On the same day, Argentina had won the America's Cup. Thousands were out celebrating. They were circulated as images from Cuba. People being abused and bleeding from police attack in Spain over a protest to do with evictions. That was circulated. A few days later, I saw on the Wednesday, I saw a video that was circulated, and it was clearly in Cuba. It showed a police officer going into the home with a pistol. He had a pistol, going into someone's home. And then, a distressed mother with a child, they were going in to make an arrest. Then you heard shots, and then it cut to an image of a pool of blood on the floor. Even I was shocked. I was, whoa, that's not good. And then, on the national news the next day, they showed the video. They showed it to the whole population. They showed how it had been circulated. When I saw it, it had been retweeted 34,000 times. But then they interviewed the man who was allegedly shot dead in his home, and they showed footage of him being taken after he was arrested at his home, being taken in handcuffs to a police car, walking calmly, and then 3 days later back in his home after he had been released after questioning, and he was saying, "No, I'm alive. I'm here. I'm fine." So incredible manipulation, which is very much part of a plan and a strategy to create a consensus for what they're calling humanitarian intervention in Cuba. No one should be so naive and so ahistorical to believe in a humanitarian intervention in Cuba. You cannot do a humanitarian intervention when you are invading with an army, or when you're doing what Miami mayor called for, airstrikes on Cuba. He called for airstrikes on Cuba on the day of the protests. So, that's what they're humanitarian. We know what it looks like. We saw it in Afghanistan 20 years down the line from a humanitarian intervention, and people are desperate to get out. So those that's covered a lot. That was the protest. I mean, I traveled around Cuba. I traveled around Havana extensively the next day. I just got out of quarantine. It was my first day. I needed to go to many different places, and I traveled everywhere, all over Havana, in public transport and taxis, and I saw no violence, no protests at all. It was calm. It was a tense calm. Yes, that's true. I heard subsequently that on one place on the edge of Havana, a violent protest took place in which one person was killed. And police were attacked and civilians were attacked. The protests, I think most Cubans were horrified about how violent the protests were. Whatever they think about, discontent with the government and the queues and so on, or the management of the Cubans are not used to the kind of health crisis that the pandemic has introduced for them. Cuba was managing the crisis phenomenally well, one among the best countries in the world. I actually made a documentary about this last year. It's available on YouTube. It's called Cuba and COVID-19, Public Health, Science and Solidarity. And it shows that, by the end of 2020, only 140, slightly more people had died in the whole year in Cuba. And what's happened is they were forced, for the economic circumstances, to open their borders, which they knew from an epidemiological perspective was not a great thing to do. They opened their borders. Lots of Cubans came back in from countries with very high incidence of COVID, the United States, Spain, all over. And community contagion has taken off. And they've got the Delta variant, which is clearly highly contagious. And they've lost control of that community transmission. But what Cuba is going through this summer is what most countries have been through throughout the pandemic, because you cannot prepare hospitals for the kind of surge in cases that the Delta variant is bringing. And so a lot of people in Cuba are also shocked by the impact of the pandemic on the island. They're shocked by having high numbers of deaths every day. They're definitely not used to that in Cuba. So I think that the protests are partly a response to that. But we just have to keep reminding people how the US sanctions has impaired Cuba's ability to respond to the pandemic. With the example I gave earlier of medical ventilators, they also have one energy oxygen plant which broke down, obviously from overuse, and they are really struggling. They've had to use all of their economic reserves at a time when the US has moved to eliminate all income and revenue to Cuba. They've used their reserves to focus on an adequate response to COVID-19.
Thank you for that. I've kept you well over the time, so I'm going to ask you for 30-second response to this final question. What is one thing that you would suggest for people who are listening, who are watching us? What is one thing you would suggest for people to do to show and to act in solidarity with the people of Cuba? What's a concrete thing that people in the United States or in Britain or elsewhere around the world can actually do to help Cubans?
I'm going to answer with two things, I'm afraid, but short. One, get make a donation to the multiple campaigns that have been set up in the US, in Britain, around the world to help Cuba with its COVID-19 vaccination campaign. So to buy syringes, there's a Saving Lives campaign in the United States. Look them up and make a donation. That's a very practical assistance. Secondly, demand an end to US sanctions. They are suffocating and asphyxiating Cuba, and particularly people in the United States. If they're not going to combat them, then they are also responsible. This is 60 years of efforts to strangle a country because it had the audacity to carry out a revolution and pursue its own sovereignty. It's a violation of the UN endorsed right to self-determination. So do that by joining the monthly protests, the caravanas, that are happening all over the United States on the last Sunday of every month. Do that by demanding that your political representatives take a position against the US blockade. Do it by any means that you can. And just be clear that what the United States is trying to do is distinguish maybe the last and best hope that we have that another world is possible.
Helen Yaffe has been with us today on Counterpunch. She's a lecturer in economic and social history at the University of Glasgow. The book, We Are Cuba: How a Revolutionary People Have Survived in a Post-Soviet World. Please get yourself a copy, get yourself two, and give one to a friend. Helen, thank you so much for coming on Counterpunch and chatting with us this morning.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Listeners, viewers, thank you again for the continued support, and we will chat again real soon.